This is Jessica Taylor interviewing Carl Fischer on July 15th, 2013 in King William County, Virginia. Mr. Fischer, can you please state your full name?
My name is Carl Robert Fischer.
Okay, what is your date of birth?
November 15th, 1939,
Where were you born?
in Rahway, New Jersey.
Did you grow up there?
Not in Rahway, but I grew up in New Jersey until I was 17. And then I left to join the Navy.
What are your parents' names and occupations?
My father's was Robert Fischer, and he was a tool and die maker. And my mother her name was Elsie, and she was a housewife.
Okay. Did you have any siblings?
Had one sister who was a year and a half younger than I was.
And I know you've had many lives, but can you talk about your occupations?
I mentioned before that I left New Jersey to join the Navy. I was somebody that didn't have a lot of interest in going to college or anything like that. The Navy was a great escape, but it also was an opportunity for me to realize that I needed to further my education. And by volunteering to go in the Navy, I had a choice of what area I wanted to go into. So I chose to go into the hospital corps. So I got trained as a naval hospital corpsman. And when I got out, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do. So I was the first male nurse at a place called Wagner College in Staten Island, New York. All the other people were female. The year behind me was my wife, who I met, who was also a year behind me in the nursing school. So I graduated from there, double majored. I majored in nursing and psychology. So the next decision was, what do I do? So I applied at several places, and I got accepted in for a master's in nursing at the State University of New York at Buffalo. They wanted me to take one more course to go into clinical psychology. And I decided I would go and get my master's in nursing. So I got my master's degree in nursing and then got pretty well unhappy with the profession of nursing and said, what can I, because I thought at that point in time that it was really a female dominated area. And I was, when I went there, I was supposed to get an emphasis on administration, but they really didn't do it. So I took all my classes, elective classes, in the School of Business. So here I am now, about to get married, been to college for 6 years, and still don't know what I want to do. So I talked to the hospital administrator at the hospital in Buffalo, New York, where I was going to school. He said, why don't you consider hospital administration? So I applied to the Yale School of Medicine and got married, left there, and went and I got a master's in public health administration from Yale. Stayed on at Yale and running their hospital there as an associate administrator. From there, I went to Cincinnati, where I was a number 2 person at Cincinnati. From Cincinnati, I went to Little Rock, Arkansas. These are all university teaching hospitals where I was the CEO. And in 1986, I came to Virginia to be the CEO of Virginia Commonwealth University, or MCV, whatever you wanted to call it back in those days. And I retired from there in 2003.
So what have you been doing since then?
Absolutely everything I could do that didn't have anything to do with healthcare related. So the first thing that I did, actually going on a historic house tour, was find out about the Archaeology Society of Virginia. And I had been, the house that I live in here, where we're here today, this was built in 1745, and it was an Indian village. So I found a lot of artifacts So I said to myself, wouldn't it be neat to know something about this? So I got involved in the Archaeological Society of Virginia. I was working with the archaeologists at Shirley Plantation in 2004, I guess it was. And he left. And I said, is there anybody in my area that I might be able to continue to work with? And they said, well, there are two young men called Thane and David. So I called them up, and that's how I got involved in Gloucester, and that's how I got familiar with the gas station.
Can you explain kind of what you do for the Fairfield Foundation?
Well, I started out originally as somebody, and I still do work with them in the field, but then I got appointed to the board, and I guess it's either been 3 or 5 years, I can't remember. When you're having fun, the time goes by. But I know I'm at least in my second term as the board president, and I have one more year as president of the board, which I've told them they're going to find somebody new at that point in time, because it's important that people shouldn't stay in a position like that too long.
It's true. Where do you see Fairfield fitting in this kind of community?
In its community?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, as you know, we have aspirations to change Fairfield's mission to go beyond what had to date been mainly the Fairfield plantation, to get into historic services, help people with restoration, national registries, things and so forth. So that's what we're focusing as the gas station would really become main education center. Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful location at the intersection of two roads. And anybody that you talk to, I'm not from that area, but anybody that you talk to remembers the old gas station, and can tell you a few stories about it if they had been there for a while. So it's a great location. It'll give them good prominent position within the community right there.
Mm-hmm. So as far as you do a lot of things with historic architecture, where do you see advocacy for old buildings and old property sites in the future? Does it have a place in an urbanizing environment?
We sort of had ups and downs in terms of preservation of buildings. It's only really been in this last century where we started to appreciate some of the things that we had. We would tore them all down before. And there's some people that are interested in, some people not interested in that. And you can't save every building that there is. But those that have some significance, we should try to preserve them. Probably in urban centers, we have a better chance of getting them preserved than where I am in a rural setting. I'm involved with the Historical Society. We own a 1734 church and some adjoining property that we are trying to put a county easement on, not a state easement on. And tomorrow night, I have to go to the second hearing where I'm getting violent opposition from all the neighbors that they don't want me to put it in an historic district. And some of the members of the Board of Supervisors don't want something put in an historic district. And it shows that there's quite a difference in some of the rural areas where people don't want change, they're fearful of change and so forth. But in the urban area, I think there's more of an opportunity to preserve things if you have the funds to do to do so.
Mm-hmm. How do we make it relevant to people that maybe don't care about it or don't understand it right now?
Well, I think you have to educate. You have to get people. And Dave Brown he's my backup tomorrow night at the Board of Supervisors meeting. I said, I'm going to say what I can say, and then you're going to be there to fill in all the background. And I've talked to David, about all the frustration, and, he feels as I do, even if we don't get this accomplished, we've done some education in relationship to the community of the importance of history and the importance of preservation. And we've taught them, we've talked about what the state does and so forth, what's on the National Registry and so forth. So whether we accomplished it or not, all wasn't lost. We've at least educated some people in the community about the need for preservation.
Has public awareness grown in the last 2 decades that you've noticed?
Oh, yes, sure. I don't know if they've done in this county, but certainly in the country, there's a lot of interest in that.
Do specific properties or moments stick out to you?
Well, I've been a member of the National Trust for Historic Preservation for a long number of years, and I get their art, their articles and so forth, and so I can see everything that's been done. I guess one preservation thing that almost got torn down, which kind of comes to mind, is Grand Central Station in New York City. We almost lost that. And although it's not an 18th century building, it's a very significant building and a big part of history.
Yeah. I mean, being a Northerner, that probably affects you differently, but did you notice like an emotional response to the pressure to demolish that structure?
Sure. Yeah, I didn't think it should be demolished, and they did a wonderful job of preserving it.
Okay. How else has preservation, as you've known it, so in this area, changed over the last 20 years?
In this county, I think there's been very little change in interest. I'll give you an example. I'm also involved with the county's Historic and Architecture Review Board. And what I found was there were historic districts that were established. But the people that were on that committee didn't know where they were, and they didn't know anything about it. They didn't know anything about the real function. And what happened, that committee was set up probably in the 70s by statute, and it has existed over these years, have done very little or nothing, and nobody knew anything about it. And we were supposed to be responsible for overseeing structures that were in a county historic district and to approve any changes to those. So I said to them, how do you go about making, because we did have a couple that came up to be reviewed once we found where the historic districts are. So first of all, we went to the tax areas and got tax maps of where the historic areas were defined, made sure the deeds recorded that they were historic districts. And then I said to them, how do you determine when you approve some changes to one of these historic buildings? They said, well, we kind of look at it and decide. I said, you have no criteria? So then I got got everybody a copy of the Department of Interior standards for renovation. And this is only 4 years ago. So you can see where this county was. Nobody knew anything about anything that was in an historic district. And we have 15 homes that are on the National Registry in this county. So, and the thing that I got the county to put in a grant to do an inventory it's a matching grant. The Historical Society is really upfronting the money for the county to start to do an inventory of the county. And we have an old map that shows where all the structures and things were. We're going to try to update that And the next thing that we want to try to do is to try to identify what are areas of this county are worth preserving and what are areas of this county where we should probably get them on the National Registry, or we should get them in an historic district or something like that. And before these things just got torn down over time, there was no mechanism or anything to worry about. So we're talking about, in this county, some changes, not a whole lot, in the last 4 years.
If you had to critique the sort of methods of the people that are interested in preserving things, in the preservationists, what would you say?
You mean what their background might be, or what causes them to be interested in
no,
preservation?
if you could improve the tactics or the philosophies of preservation, what would you say or do?
Well, first you have to convince somebody that preservation of something has some meaning. So if we tear down everything will look like what was just recently built, and it will have no bridge to the past. And then we can understand culture also through architecture. So we lose some of culture there also, and we lose history, because all these buildings are related to history also. Now, you can't preserve every building, but I think maybe you could convince people that there are certain buildings that are important to be saved. And I think the other thing that you have to do is these necessarily don't have to be old, but they have to be unique in some way. Because I mean, National Trust says 50 years is their cutoff. So we could have something 50 years old that's important enough to be preserved. And that's people can understand 300-year-old building, but some people can't understand why you want to preserve a 50-year-old building, but that's another challenge.
Well, for you personally, how do you prioritize? How do you if you see two buildings, how do you decide which one is worth saving?
Well, first I'd like to find out the history of the building. Mm-hmm. Then I think you have to do an analysis of the building and what's involved in preserving it. And you might find one of those buildings are beyond preservation. I mean, everything can be preserved, but you might put 100% recycled material in that one building, and you wouldn't have much left. Where the other one, it might not be significant. And then, of course, in relationship to the two, what's the ability to get the funds to do the building? Now, if they were sort of equal in need for renovation, I would weigh what's the historical background or historical significance of the building, and if one was stronger than the other, and they were about equal or near close to one another in terms of cost to restore them, I would weigh more towards the one that had important historical background. Mm. Or, historical, now I'm talking about people involved in the building, the architecture of the building, and so forth. Yeah.
Sometimes I worry about that, especially I just got back from Mississippi, for example, and the homes that a lot of the DHR people have put on the register are, plantation homes from the 19th century, because that's what tourists want to come see.
But they didn't have any slave quarters on there.
No, exactly.
and other things.
So How do we convince people of all historical significances, or multiple, at least, contexts that are significant?
Well, because they're part of history, and they're part of the culture. I mean, people should be interested in how did people live in those slave quarters just as much as how is the other person lived in the mansion. But we've seen a lot of renewal in African American history. I mean, one of the things that struck me when I started a museum for this county through the Historical Society 5 years ago. I spent a year of my life doing all the research for it and put together a committee to help me. And I wanted to make sure it was representative of the community. We have 2 Indian reservations here. Before the Civil War, this was about 65% African American in this county, and now it's about 25. So when I put the committee together, I wanted representation of the population. There were no Indians or African Americans involved in the Historical Society. So we said that half of the members of the Museum Council didn't have to be part of the Historical Society. And we got African Americans and we got Native Americans on there. Now, what I'm leading up to is when we tried to go back and get information to try to put things in the museum to represent those groups. On the African American side, they had not preserved very much of their history. They couldn't tell me a lot about the background. They had very few artifacts that we could use. So we had to go through whatever literature we could find to try to document the African American existence in this community, because the African Americans had not kept that up. I mean, I found the same thing, unfortunately, with the Native Americans. Some of them knew something about it, but others, I mean, I and other people knew a lot more about their history than they knew about. Now, they could give you tribal stories that had been passed on, okay? Mm-hmm. But they probably couldn't tell you the story of when the Indians got slaughtered in different years and so forth here, and what happened to them. After I assembled a museum and we got these artifacts and these things down, I said to myself, it's nice to have a museum, but to me, the importance of the museum is not to display artifacts, but to collect information that's historical in nature and preserve it. Mm-hmm. So if I had no artifacts, but if I had rich history, mm-hmm. I would feel I would still be a success in relationship to the museum business. I mean, one of the examples that was somebody gave us a letter written in, I think, somewhere around 1730 to the colonial governor asking if he could be the sheriff of King William County. And I thought that would be interesting to find out, since we were going to display his letter to the colonial governor, whether he ever became the sheriff of King William County. Well, I went to the county clerk's office. Unfortunately, most of our records were burned, but they had no record of that. I went to the sheriff's office. They had no record of they had never kept any records of who the sheriffs were. And finally, I found out from the Virginia Historical Society that, in fact, he was appointed for 1 year by the governor as sheriff of King William County. And to me, that artifact wasn't as important as getting the facts and figures and the history together.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's wonderful. So creating an inclusive environment, that incorporates African American and Native American people, but also history, is clearly important to you. How do you think the field can improve on that over time?
Well, I think we're making great strides in terms of documentation of African American history in the country. When I pick up the William and Mary Quarterly and look in the back of that, there's probably more books written on African American history than anything else in the back. The new books that are coming out. So we're getting that history together. Mm-hmm. Native American I can't say that there's the same interest in Native American history. There's very little new stuff that's coming out in relationship to them, and I guess there aren't that many of them present with us also. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's true. I wanted to ask if you had, anything to add about how Fairfield can play a role in kind of solving some of the issues of preservation or moving it forward, because you have a stake in that too, obviously.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that Fairfield is doing today is in-field archaeology. So the difference, the way Fairfield has gone about it, is you don't stand over the fence and watch them do it. You can, with supervision, get in and actually dig in the ground. So people walk away with a different feeling and a different involvement than the fact that and probably spend a lot more time than there's somebody just looking over the fence. So what we're doing is teaching future generations about archaeology, and also what archaeology tells us about culture. So that's a big educational thing, and that will breed people that have an interest in. Not everybody that's dug in the ground is going to be interested, but I bet you're going to get some that are going to be interested in that. The other thing that our plans to do is to help people that want to get something on the National Registry, to help them do the background and so forth about that. People want to try to establish a historic district to help them to do that. To put people in contact with people in the preservation field if somebody needs some help. To publish material that would be read by people, and also provide documentation that was important to the field. And the significant thing there is that the intent is to reach out to a wider geographic area than just the Gloucester community. It's several counties involved. So that, those are some of the ways that I think they're going to reach out to probably 5 or 6 counties.
Mm-hmm. That's a really bright vision. That's really all I have to ask you. Did you want to contribute anything else to the population of University of Florida?
I guess the only interesting thing is, although my career had nothing to do with history, when I got married, my wife and I went to Colonial Williamsburg for our honeymoon. So there must have been some history thing there embedded in the both of us that's only come out in our later years of life. Although we've been interested in history, but we haven't sort of devoted our whole lives to history as we have in recent years.
Did you love it when you went?
Oh yeah, we had a great time. But we still go back several times a year because we learn something every time we go back. Mm-hmm. And we prayed our grandkids through there. This week was a couple grandkids are here and took them up to Mount Vernon. So we're we're working on the next generation to try to educate them.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for interviewing me.